right, everybody. Let me start by thanking the sponsors because they make these community events what they are, so thank you. I'll go do the tour myself after this, but we have lunch to get to, so let's get started. I'm Matthew Morris. I spent the last 15 plus years in the Salesforce world and last 30 plus years in technology. And what I'm here to talk to you about today is really looking to the very near future and beyond when we're thinking about Salesforce architecture. I have a blog, put the QR code and the website up there. There'll be posts coming from this content. This content is still warm. So when I signed up to speak here and my presentation was accepted, this presentation didn't look like this at all. That's how much has changed just really in the last few months. So we're going to talk about three things today. We'll talk about the Salesforce that you all have, one or more orgs, big or small. And then we're going to talk about the challenges and what I think we're going to be needing in the very near future, right now, and going forward as we navigate this technology shift, which is not going to happen overnight. I don't think it will evolve over time, but we need to start thinking about it. And that's what I've been doing really for the last 2.5 years, thinking about how things are going to change and what they need to look like. And that's really where we come on to at the end, which is to think about what might that architecture need to include, and how architecture and engineering now are much more closely coupled than perhaps they were before. So, see if I remember what we've written. So I think the first thing is, even if you've got a long-standing investment in Salesforce, there's probably a lot of stuff in your org, but it's not necessarily broken. I think, oftentimes when for a consultant, we start with different clients, you kind of go in and go, okay, what are we going to find in here? And you start looking through and like, oh my God, look at this, look at that. But there's also a lot of value in there, in addition to, a lot of noise, right? And I know there's been a lot of effort by people over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years to pay back what's called technical debt. I don't think that's been entirely successful, or very successful if I'm honest. But that doesn't mean that the value isn't in there. And change is a constant. This is why Salesforce is so successful, because they are a business tool sold to the business for business needs. So people who are looking for technical purity, this is probably not the platform for that. And so, the business change is going to be driving change within the system. We also have the challenge that there is no golden build for Salesforce. So we may have multiple groups of people contributing to what is the runtime environment, what is the production environment. So that challenge of the delta between, well, it works on my machine, it doesn't work in production, we need to be able to navigate that as well. And so I think there's a change in mindset, or an evolution in mindset that's needed really, which is around the stewardship and thinking about how to look after it, not just to deliver today, but what this means for the future. And I'm sure many of us have always sort of talked about that or intended that at the beginning of a project, but with deadlines and timelines being what they are, it's one of the things that suffers. But now I believe over the next 10 years or so, this is much, much more consequential. And why is it consequential? Well, AI. There we go. Managed to get it in the first 5 minutes of the presentation. Why AI? That's a very good question. But certainly from a systems point of view, it compresses the amount of time and the amount of information that we have in our feedback loops. So there's much more information available. And again, if there's a lot of noise, that noise is going to get compressed and it's going to drown out the insights that we're looking for. AI also amplifies the hidden dependencies. So I think Ellie was mentioned earlier when she was presenting around observability, which is a really key thing that we all need now these days. Finding those hidden dependencies, putting logs into an AI. So in her case, I think she was using Vibes, but anyone will work. You can uncover a great deal of dependencies, but are those dependencies valid? If you've got lots of stuff still in the org that shouldn't be there, again, it's creating noise. And all of this invisible complexity then builds up to add to the risk of change. So if we don't understand what the effect of the change is going to be, we're increasing the risk of doing that. And this is all happening at the same time that these same advanced technologies with advanced analytical capabilities, advanced generative capabilities, are pushing the delivery to go ever faster. So we need to execute cleaner. We need to get to the underlying detail and be confident in it sooner. That's the challenge. And this really is an example of, conceptually one of those problems, right? So we may have a Sales Cloud implementation within our sales domain. We understand that very well. That's where we live. We don't do anything in the finance org, right? Maybe that runs in SAP or something like that, right? But we do have something. We do have some investment in the integration layer, and so we understand that there's a very clear contract there that exists between our sales org and the integration layer. And as far as we're concerned, then we're done. Now, as we start to see more AI come into processes, or the desire to have these included in processes, the system kind of goes up, or the level of observing goes up one. So the AI itself might have visibility across the sales domain and the integration and the finance domain. So as it tries to operate a process within finance, it knows that it needs to retry something, and it can just go and ask the sales org. Well, we didn't plan for that. So these kinds of hidden complexities where previously we had what we thought was a well-defined contract, and if it went wrong, somebody in the accounts team would probably ring us up and say, oh, we need to resubmit such and such an opportunity or such and such a contract so the commission can be paid. If we want that to be an automated process, we need to close the loop, and we need to have that detailed out. So having that understanding is vital, and the impact of this happening to us unexpectedly is quite high. And the likelihood at the moment is also quite high because we tend to look at things from a siloed point of view. So really, it's thinking about that higher level of abstraction that we need to understand the system as a whole at a business level, rather than just thinking about our process within our Salesforce org. So when we start to think about how we're going to change, we're really talking about modernization. And this isn't the first wave of modernization. It's the first time it's happened to Salesforce, but it's not the first time that this has happened within technology. So 25 years ago, mainframes were becoming out of favor. People wanted to go to client server systems, and then wanted to go to the cloud. There's been these waves of modernization that we've gone through, and now it's time for us to address that within the Salesforce ecosystem. And that ties into that value that I said at the start is contained within our org. But what are we up against? Well, we're up against that consistent pressure of drift. People keep creating new stuff. That's going to start changing the status quo, the known state that we have within the org. And as that delta grows, it's going to increase the risk. So do we know how the org works? Do we know how the business works? That's going to be ever changing. So we need to have an architecture and an engineering approach which is going to be able to inform us about that. And then this is going to be an ongoing exercise. We're not going to say, stop doing all of the new delivery that we're doing, stop doing all the BAU work, but we need to also do modernization alongside that work that we're doing. So from my point of view, I think there's going to be more work for us to do rather than less, because this is something which is critical in order to sustain the life of a business's investment within the Salesforce platform for the next 10 years or so, right? We're not talking about next week, we're not talking about next month. Change takes time. And if you think about perhaps the business that you work in, if you've got 5 years, maybe 10 years invested in Salesforce, I think the day is gone now of saying, oh, we're going to switch over to Dynamics, right? We didn't build that org 10 years ago, and we've used it for 10 years. We've been building it for 10 years. And so again, all of that value, all of that business knowledge is layered up within our org. It has value to us. And so rather than think about, well, how can we go to a Greenfield, we need to embrace modernizing. And the challenge really is getting people with the money to understand this. So this is the only AI-generated picture, by the way. I couldn't spend any time trying to draw a nice pretty graph. This worked for me. But it's really this idea that money ebbs and flows. And it's only really when things reach a critical point that some money comes in order to do some kind of a rescue, do some kind of like drastic remediation, and then the money dries up again. And I think this is the change in attitude and one that's going to be very challenging to make the case for, because it requires consistent effort. But being able to help help stakeholders to understand the opportunity that exists from the business value that is contained within the orgs, but also that we can't just gain access to that for free, right? It requires investment that perhaps goes beyond a single project, that goes beyond a single business objective. So, what do we need to do? Get the clicker working. There we go. So first of all, what we need to address is the visibility. So in order to understand what's the context of what's going on within our Salesforce org and therefore within our business, we need to have that visibility. Because if we can't see it, how are we going to govern it? How are we going to understand it? And then how are we going to modernize it? And I think not only within the lifetime of a system, where we start off with one particular architecture, and then 5 years later, it's starting to fray around the edges because the business has moved. This can also happen in a shorter time frame within a project. If you've ever, I'm sure you've worked on a project as I have, where you've started out with the best of intentions, but again, if it's perhaps 12 months long, by the time you get to 8 months in, sprints are really the thing that's the governing factor in terms of the choices that we're making. And therefore, we're starting to lose that North Star that we had set around the architecture and the approach. So that idea of our architecture actually being emergent, right? It's not set in stone at the beginning. We need to remain flexible, and we need to be able to accommodate that within our governance structure so that things don't just happen and drift, but that we understand we need to make an alteration, and we govern that correctly. And then the last thing I think is really around the topic of observability, captured very well earlier by Ellie. The running system tells us an awful lot about what's going on. There's a difference between what's configured and what runs. It might be that we've got multiple pathways that are configured within our process automations, whether that be workflows, whether that be flows, whether that be Apex. We've got validation rules, perhaps. Not all of these paths are going to be hit. And the only place that we'll see what is being hit is if we've got that observability over the runtime information. And so having that running system as an input into our visibility, along with inputs from what I call our engineering system. So this is much more than DevOps. This is much more than CI/CD. This is where we're now taking those artifacts that have been created during our specification phases. So whether that be stories, whether that be acceptance criteria, whether it be epics, whether it be business requirements documents, we have all that within our versioned repository, and all of these things now are tied together so that we can then feed these in. And this then gives us the ability to be able to measure and map what is running, and also verify that what is happening is what we intended to happen. And this needs to be a connected process. So it can't be now that testing exists by a separate team that's disconnected from our delivery team or from our architecture team. Because remember, we're here to serve the needs of the business. We need to understand, what does the business need? What does the system need to retain health, to remain healthy? And then how does that be sustained over time? And so only by collecting together as inputs the runtime observability that we have, as well as our intentions expressed from our repositories, can we then have our context. And that tells us this is what we expect the system to do, and this is how we expect it to run. And then that gives us the ability to trust it and to be able to use it in everyday operation, right? And we can provide the proof that it is doing what we intended it to do. And this, I think, is a much more holistic approach than I'm certainly familiar with in my Salesforce life for the last 15 years, where we perhaps operated on a project approach, or we operated on a sales or a service type mindset. It's really thinking much more holistically about the business. So we'll come on to a bit more about AI then. So I think this is really where my thinking at least has changed over the last 3 months or so. I think at the end of last year, we were still talking very much in prompts when it came to the use of AI within our delivery process, within our tooling. So whether that was from the point of view of using analytical techniques to understand an org, to understand a requirements document, or to be able to define something that we wanted to happen, that we wanted some Apex written, or we wanted some metadata to create some fields for us that we could then deploy to our org. The mindset, at least that I had at the end of last year, was very much around transactional prompting. And I think what we have the opportunity to do is to get to something which is much more holistic and much more complete. And it's really intent. It's about the intention of what we want to happen as a whole, as well as the particular task that we're dealing with at the moment. And if we think about taking things as a whole, what does the business want? What do we want to do within our project? What do we want to do within this particular work stream? And then what does my feature want? There's going to be trade-offs between that. And so having the clear picture of what those trade-offs are, not in our heads, but having that recorded is also going to become increasingly important. And I think that this is one of the opportunities for Salesforce professionals to bring that experience that perhaps we've used implicitly within our heads for the last 10 or 15 years, to use our judgment about, are we going to do that as a formula field, or we're going to calculate that in some kind of an automation so it's written. A lot of time those decisions are made without any record. It's really just, sometimes it's a style choice. We can't do that because that kind of stuff continues to build up technical debt, right? It clouds the reason why something is the way that it is. Why has a solution been created the way it has? We need to be able to record that much more fully. And in that way, be much more intentional about what we're saying needs to happen. So really, prompt engineering was how we played around with that last year, but prompts are so much less than everything else that we have available. So if you think about within a project lifecycle, within a program lifecycle, within a business, what are all of the documents and artifacts that are available to us? And it's a huge amount of information. And I think that this is one of the things I reflect on during my career over the past 30 years, where Agile kind of started, in the late 90s as a way to get things done quickly. And prior to that, we'd actually decided we weren't going to do anything quickly. We were going to do everything thoroughly before we wrote any code. And that's because writing code was expensive. But then businesses were unhappy because they weren't getting anything done. And that's where Agile then started to be, well, we're going to get stuff done. And ever since then, we've increasingly been in a much more transactional type mode. I think that we need to move back to a world where we're much more thorough upfront in terms of a complete picture of the business requirements. And then from that, we can express the functional requirements. And then from that, we can produce this technical specification for the solution. This kind of detail fits into the pyramid that I've got here in terms of that body of evidence about why a system is as it is today, why choices have been made, and therefore, when we want to make changes to it, we've got much more thorough information. So this could be policies and governance structures that we've got. It can be rules that we, perhaps again, today are implicit, that we need to write down. So, actions that are allowed, deviations that are allowed, what the acceptable level of deviation is. And at the base of it all is the business goal, right? Why are we trying to do what we're trying to do? And all of this depth of meaning that exists allows us to be much more intentional about what we want the AI to want. And this is something which I think we're going to continue to navigate this year to understand more the implications of. But if you think about perhaps your experience with prompting, where you tried to get it to do something and it tried a little bit and then it gave up, it's because there wasn't enough intention there, or where it came back with some outputs which were unexpected. Again, there wasn't enough intention, there wasn't enough context for it to use. And so from an architecture and an engineering point of view within the Salesforce world, we need to secure this information, which includes that picture of our org, right? Version copies of our metadata so that we can see how change happens over time. All of this context is incredibly valuable. And I think it's one of the plus points for the Salesforce platform, within this disruption, is that we do have a strongly typed metadata layer that provides an additional layer of information above and beyond what the business requirements were. So it's that combination then of the running system. So can we observe it? What's actually executing? What's the difference between the paths that are configured and the paths that are being traveled? Do we have a clear picture of who's doing what? We can tie that into our context about user personas, for example. So perhaps we didn't do this in the past because this is a lot of data points to keep in our head. But the opportunity for us to use these advanced tools to analyze more of these data points, is, I think, pretty much limitless, provided we've got good data that we trust. And so, having your system be observable, keeping that copy of information, and then acting upon it, looking to improve the hygiene, to improve the cleanliness of those processes and remove things that aren't being used, over time we can begin to modernize. We'll talk a little bit more about the engineering system in a minute, but this really is our software development lifecycle. And this is my opinion, but what I think the direction of travel is a world where we don't go into the setup menu very much. We're not configuring individual pieces of Salesforce. Instead, we're driving it from the outside and we're getting chunks of functionality produced that achieve a business goal. And I think that this is a shift in mindset that perhaps we'll see over the next 12 months or so. Within my company and within the teams I work with, this is something that we're exploring at the moment. It's a different approach from working in a coding tool and getting it to write some code, looking at it and saying, well, I wouldn't have written it like that. Nobody, if we go back in time, this is what the machine code programmers of the 70s said when somebody invented assembler. And then this is what the assembler guys said when somebody invented C. These higher levels of abstraction are just really a natural progression within technology. So I spoke at the beginning about these waves of technology, these waves of disruption. This is an example really where we're going to be moving, I believe, to a higher level of abstraction. So thinking about describing what we want the system to do, what we want that part of the system to do, and then having the solution produced. How do we know it's doing what we want it to do? Well, that's where testing goes to the next level. So thinking about test scenarios that are independent of the specifications that we've produced so that we're able to, to test it using tests which haven't been seen by the person taking the test, if you will. So being able to validate that through our governance policies and through our testing strategies, then we'll tie all that up. So I think this is something that is consistent throughout my time in Salesforce world, which is I think that we all feel a very strong sense of ownership and a sense of stewardship about the orgs that we look after. And I think solo admins are probably the pinnacle of this. They very much want to guard and protect and steward the org because when things break, they're the ones who has to fix it. But equally, they know the potential, they know the power, that can be achieved if processes are working correctly, if things are working cleanly. So, this idea of stewardship, I think, is one, if you spent any time in the Salesforce world, you're already familiar with. But I think, thinking about the value, so if we're talking about how we describe it to stakeholders, the value of what we've got contained within the Salesforce org, we've had it for 10 years, we've got 10 years worth of business understanding in here, helps people to appreciate why the health of the platform is so important, and we really need to make that explicit. And I think, for myself, I guess primarily in an architect role, if I still am, it's really, stewardship that's really a leadership role that people taking the responsibility as an architect, certainly, can lean into. But I think the roles that we're historically familiar with, they all still exist because, again, nothing's going to change overnight. This is going to be an evolutionary process. So I think this is additive rather than replacement. So in terms of our admin, it's being able to understand the runtime of the org, what is actually happening beyond what's configured. That's perhaps something that's not a core skill today, but tools exist, techniques exist to be able to do that. And then there's AI in every tool. Being able to govern that AI in a tactical fashion, also extremely important. I think the other one that I would call out is the platform engineer. So I think that this is a term, it's a role which has not really been spoken about enough within the Salesforce world. And I've certainly seen it growing in the last 5 years or so. This is much more than just the guy who put together the CI/CD pipeline. This is really starting to think about Salesforce as a true platform and treating it as such. So it's more than just the DevOps and the release management. It's really thinking about how that pipeline can scrutinize and enforce the policies that we've set up. And this is something that I've been experimenting with over the last year or so, where as you push things through your deployment pipeline, you can have either programs or analytical AI looking at your governance policies, looking at your key design decisions, looking at your risk logs, and assessing what it's seeing coming across the pipeline. And if it's got concerns about that, it can raise a warning. And then as you grow more confident with that, you can start to put hard blocks on things. So this is technology that 2 years ago didn't really exist, wasn't really readily available to us. But it's certainly something that I think is one of the biggest opportunities, is to increase the capability of our pipelines so that we're not just enforcing governance within a design authority meeting where everybody nods and then somebody goes off and builds whatever they were going to build anyway. Instead, we can enforce it within the pipeline so that we can start to limit the attrition of the quality of the org. I guess I should mention data, particularly with Salesforce getting much more into the data world with the acquisition of Informatica. This is certainly something which I think everybody really needs to get much more confident and familiar with, because whenever anybody says AI, they say data. It's all about the data, garbage in, garbage out, or whatever other sayings that people want to say. But I think historically, our Salesforce orgs, we've been quite parochial. We've been quite siloed in terms of our thinking. Well, these are my objects, that's my data. But in order for us to serve the needs of the business as a whole, we need to be thinking about that enterprise data layer. And then last of all, our AI contributor, which is not a real problem, not a real person, not a real problem, that's a bit Freudian slip, isn't it? Not a real person, and they can be assisted or autonomous. And it's really to think about, well, what's the difference between that? What is assisted? What is autonomous? What are the difference? So I put this chart together to really sort of contrast where I think we're at the moment. I think the AI companies would have us believe that we're all ready for fully autonomous. I'm not wholly confident that we are, but it's certainly worth experimenting to see what the potential is. In terms of assisted, I think these are the skills that I think many of us are starting to get to grips to, starting to get the grips with, to think about how we supervise, to think about how we limit the effects of when something goes wrong. How do we limit the blast radius? It's a very dramatic term, isn't it? But how do we limit that? Because if we can understand that within an assisted context, we're then in a better place to start to understand as we explore these ideas of autonomous. And I think that my own observation around Agentforce is, I think Agentforce is a great opportunity for businesses to explore the idea of autonomous processes and how much more responsibility they need to take about designing those things. Again, going back to our sort of idea of implicit judgment that as Salesforce professionals, we've kind of provided quietly for the last decade plus, needing to be much more intentional, needing to be much more specific about exactly what are the steps of those in that process. And going back to the earlier slide about unintended retries and unexpected paths through the wider system. If we want to get to autonomous, we need to have people understand that there's more work to be done up front in order to be confident that what we produce is going to work as we intend it to work. So I think for right now, assisted, I'm pretty confident with. Autonomous, certainly, great potential to be explored. Okay, so what are the sorts of things we need? So I think when I first did this presentation, the presentation of a similar name, in June last year at London's Calling, my emphasis was, all of it was really around this. What might the Salesforce org of the future look like? And that was because I felt like I was operating in a bit of a vacuum. For me, it seemed like there was great potential with technologies coming out of, I think what was at the time Data Cloud, now Data 360. Surely it must be an opportunity for us to start to compartmentalize our functionality. But I think subsequent to that, over the last, over the back half of last year, Salesforce have been much more proactive in terms of sharing how they see tools like Data 360 working within a multi-org environment, for example. So I've now shifted where I'm thinking to kind of more of an architectural type approach to it, which is to really think about what are our boundaries, right? So boundaries around our domains, boundaries around integrations between different systems, and then what are those shared anchors? What are the common layers? So rather than draw it explicitly within Salesforce terms, I'm thinking about it at a slightly higher level of abstraction, right? So within our single org monolith approach, which I think is the majority of Salesforce implementations, thinking about layering our automation, thinking about layering our integration so that we have clear boundaries. At the moment, Salesforce orgs that I see are very interwoven, and that's a natural product of how we solution in Salesforce. When we try to solve a problem in Salesforce, we've got all the tools available to us. Yeah, we've got call-outs, we've got Apex, we've got validation rules, we've got platform events. You can mix and match all of these things. And I think layering, particularly with these workflow and with these integration points, is going to be so critical as we move forward in terms of modernization. And then from a business context, starting to think about how do we produce domains inside our Salesforce org. And this is where techniques like packaging, unlock packaging can help us to start to identify and compartmentalize this functionality belongs to this domain. Therefore, if you're making change in a different domain, don't touch it. At the moment, that's not clear. And that's really, I think, what prevented a lot of the technical debt cleanup approaches really getting traction because everything was so interwoven. So this idea of separate domains is really key to us being able to, sustain and grow these orgs over the decade ahead. And I do believe, there's at least a decade's worth of life, of work to be done, a decade's worth of value, if you will. And then we've got our shared anchors, right? So thinking about things like data, thinking about how we control them and version our configuration. And then data. What data needs to exist within a domain? What data exists across the wider enterprise? And that's really where I came into this a year ago, thinking about the potential for Data 360, thinking about how data model objects could help this. I think really it's kind of a situation by situation case, and this is going to evolve over time because going and try and bolt on new technology to your existing org isn't really necessarily the solution. I think now I'm much more on to thinking about how do we separate things. But looking a bit further out, if we are able to separate those domains, it could be that we're in a much stronger position to start to physically separate that functionality as well. And I think if we do that and start to make use, if it's appropriate, of multiple Salesforce orgs and think about them as application containers for specific purposes rather than it's our Salesforce org, that gives us two key benefits, which I think are less in a single org. And that is the idea of having a shared data backbone, so we can link multiple functional orgs together through technologies within Data 360, as well as give it access to wider enterprise data. And this, for me, I think is where the emerging picture around Informatica and MuleSoft is also very interesting as we think about how do we have the enterprise data model and have Salesforce be a part of that, but it's not the whole of that. And I think, again, that's a difference from our way of thinking in the past where we were doing a Salesforce project. Salesforce was the entire world. That's everything we need. As we know, in order for this AI technology shift, we need to have more data. We need to have a better picture of data. And so we need to have Salesforce connected into the enterprise. And then the other benefit really is the ability to version features. So we can maintain a single code base, and then we can deploy our functionality out to the appropriate orgs. And that means things are much less tightly bound together than they would be in a single org. But you've got to have those boundaries. We can't just all move to a multi-org strategy. I'm not suggesting that. But it's really about how can we put layers of abstraction between our business. And that's really comes back to the engineering system, how that collection, not only of code, but also of specification, of governance, can also be drawn together so that we can use it to direct our system overall. And that's how, ultimately, we can make this be a much more durable architecture, to have our design and our build and then our deployment work in a much more virtuous circle. And so, we can answer the question by navigating across that circle. Okay, what I designed, is it at 12 o'clock? Is it what's running at 6 o'clock on that picture, right? In terms of what we designed, what's the feedback that we're getting from the running system? How is that working? All of this now becomes a much more connected and holistic experience. And so I think that that's the biggest shift as we move into the future. So really, that's it from me in terms of thinking about, what does the future look like? I think that we need to think much bigger. I think we need to really champion the stewardship and the quality in order that businesses can unlock that value. Starting again is not an option. It's really about how do we evolve forward and how do we think about doing that in a safe and controlled way. That's pretty much it from me. So thank you very much for taking the time. There's a feedback code, and I'll be happy to chat afterwards if you want to talk more about my crazy ideas. Okay, thank you.